Okay, hello everybody, and welcome to episode 8 of Dissensus, the show where we don't have to agree and we don't have to agree to disagree. We can just talk about stuff. Today is maybe a very special episode of Dissensus, possibly insofar as it makes it sound like we're drunk. We're not. We're tired. Is the answer. Both of us independently are quite tired. Now, this does not strike me as entirely disadvantageous. As I've mentioned before, there was a time a number of years ago when I was in analysis twice a week during the summers, because that's when I had the money and had the time to do analysis twice a week. And my analyst was 12 minutes away from my house on foot. And I scheduled one in the evening, one of those sessions, weekly sessions, the evening, but the other first thing in the morning. And so they had a very different character to them. The evening session was fully armored Anderson. He had his golden defense plating fully in place, his persona fixed, and often came in roaring with a customary set of issues backed with swagger. But the morning Anderson, on the other hand, would roll out of bed and pull cobwebs off of his face and, sort of try to get the crust of dreams out of his eyes and drag himself directly into session without even fully booting consciousness up. And it turned out that actually was a surprisingly productive state. Maybe unsurprisingly, you're going in for dream analysis half asleep is surprisingly productive state. But yeah, and so respectively, both Christine and I don't want to speak or reveal on her behalf, but I made one of the cardinal mistakes of, I hesitate to even call it adulthood, insofar as I taught lecture last night and then was ill and then got home and then at 10, I clocked into a game and thought, I'll just do a couple quick things before bed. And at 4:30 in the morning, I said, oh my God, I have to go to sleep. I have work and things tomorrow. This is not an open space, but, and I'll come back around to this if we have time. This is a shout out for No Man's Sky, a game that I was quite enthusiastic about the release of back in 2015 when Hype Train was running hot, and then when it dropped in 2016, heard a lot of and then more recently it came out on the Switch, one of my systems of preference, and I read a bunch of reviews that were like, No Man's Sky is amazing now, it's the greatest turnaround in video game history, and so on and so forth. So I grabbed that, and it is compelling in an extremely dangerous way. If for those of you who play such games, specifically open world games, where you get that the breath of the wild compulsion, where you're doing something, it's a little something, and then you look and you're like, oh, what's that over there? And so you're like, I'll just check it out quick. And oh, what's that over there? I'll just check it out quick. Oh, wait, I'll just collect 10 mushrooms. Oh, wait. Oh, there's a dungeon. Okay, I'll do that quick. Oh, hey, some NPC. Oh, village. Hey, what's that over there? Hey, I wonder if I could climb that mountain. Hey, what's that over there? That's what Breath of the Wild was like. This is that. But if you don't know the premise of this game, it is a procedurally generated science fiction exploration game. And the sort of original selling feature of this thing, which they have gradually come to fulfill the promise on, is it's all procedurally generated. It's very little crafted, artistically bespoke content, although, right? So the thing is that you're exploring space, you're in a spacesuit, you get a spaceship, later you get other bigger spaceships. The content is very deep, and they've released 3 big updates a year for the last 6 years to bring this thing up to the original vision of it. But the procedurally generated component means that this thing has 16 quintillion unique planets. Quintillion. That's 18 zeros. So it has 256 galaxies to explore. I'm in the first galaxy, and I've just been trying to make my way to the center of this thing, but it's 800,000 light years across, like a galaxy. And so even though I can move faster than light, and I've been making shortcuts through black holes and shit, it's like slow going, and I keep finding planets with biomes I've never seen, and political situations I've not seen, and unique animals, plants, minerals on every world that I'm cataloging. And the content is so, the content chains are so deep that you could really play any number of different games in this game. And people do. Some people do a base building thing, people set up trade empires. I seem to have fallen into, curiously enough, a part-time career as a pirate hunter. But yeah, it's
hold on one second.
gonzo.
Because I think like I'm a little bit confused right now, or maybe this is a silly question, but procedurally generated. So do you mean that they have like all of these, like it's all in components, like they've got, and then they're just assembling them in different ways? So like you've got like animals and like a whole set of like different like textures and things like that they then assemble, and then that mathematical assembly of all those creates that quintillion number that you said of planets?
Yeah. So there are,
wow.
I don't know, how many factors, but the idea is, yeah, there are a bunch of randomized factors that fit together in a bunch of ways, right? So there are definitely similarities. You do see species that sort of resemble each other, right, on different worlds, but there's a lot of different world types, and they keep adding more, right? And the terrain sort of generates mathematically on the basis of some kind of sort of seed within the overall parameter space. So the parameter space for the planets is 16 quintillion when you count out all the factors, right? And so you might find worlds with some superficial similarity, right? And they definitely come in types, right? But you get there, and the planet's flora and fauna have a particular like color scheme. The sky looks in a certain way. The terrain generates on the fly when you get there. And this is part of the original promise of this thing, which is it's so big that despite the fact that it has a big player base, and the Switch version is not multiplayer, but the PC and all the original versions are all multiplayer, or can be. You can play multiplayer. But the thing is that when you set down on a planet, odds are you are the first player to
that's what I was
it.
just gonna, yeah, that's what I was gonna ask. Like, because then it would make it difficult if it generates the moment that you set foot there, and it's based on an algorithm, like the time for people to actually find the same planet as you set foot on. Yeah.
Right.
Huh.
So most of the planets which I have visited, and most of the systems which I have visited thus far, were discovered by me. Actually discovered by me. And so when you get there, you can catalog the life forms and the terrain and the features and whatever. You can do base building, which is actually quite extensive. I started, but I've gotten much more. It goes a lot deeper than I originally thought. And then if you have a sort of a base computer setup or whatever, you can rename stuff, the species, the planet, the whatever, if you're the discoverer, and then you upload it. And when you upload it, it goes to their central server. And so at that point thereafter, if somebody else in their game happens to stumble across that world, it indicates the stuff you uploaded, right? They can discover. Cool. So I found 1 or 2 planets that were actually discovered by another player, amazingly enough.
What type of stuff do they leave?
I haven't discovered any constructed artifacts, so I haven't found any bases or anything, but I have found planets that were discovered and obviously named by players. But like 1 or 2, they must have been passing through the system on their way someplace else.
You get to name the planet?
Yeah. You can name the planet, you can name the species, you can rename your ships, you can... What else can you do? You can rename all kinds of stuff, and then it uploads. It goes through a standard, profanity filter, I think. But you can, you rename stuff. And in theory, I believe if you construct a base on a world, even in the single player, I think if somebody shows up, they will find that base.
I'm sorry, but I just have to say that that's so biblical. Like in this, what is it? The second Genesis, I think it was, or the second creation myth in the Bible. The first one is like the hierarchical form where God has a plan and then he's executing that. And like the vision's all his. And but then the second one is more of like a creative form of the myth, which is where I think that God actually asked man to name the animal. And then
The so-called first commandment. There's an argument that I've read that's like, if you interpret that liberally, it means the first commandment is science.
Oh yeah.
Right? Name all the things.
Yeah, but it's the fact that like God is kind of like engaging in this creative process with you, where it's like, I don't know, you go ahead and name it. It's like that, and it's like, ooh, that looks good. I agree with that. All right, let's keep going.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of cool that this stuff that they're, when you're discovering the new land, that the thing that they're first leaving behind is just the act of having named something. That's fun.
And your name is attached to it automatically if you upload it, discovered by. Right.
Yeah.
And then in addition, if you rename, I've only renamed a fraction of the planets and animals and stuff. I mean, at this point, I've cataloged hundreds of species and dozens of worlds. So I've only renamed a fraction of that stuff, typically where I set up my, my bases and things. But it is, there are huge, like I said, there are huge, deep subsystems in this game that I haven't even scratched. Haven't even come near, and I've put in at this point more hours than I reasonably ought to have, in downtime. But yeah, it has that compelling quality. So now, just to counterbalance this, I want to hear why you're tired, and I want to hear your World of Warcraft story in particular. But anyway, so this was all an extremely long lead-in to say I'm underslept because of the compulsive qualities of a flow hijacking exploration experience.
That's so cool. So I mean, there's three things, and I don't know which route to pursue that are coming out of this. So one is just that I still find it so interesting, the fact that the whole idea of naming is the thing that you're leaving behind. And part of that is also because of this one. I was reading about like the book of Job, and that the moral of, well, like part of that story is asking the question, how many things can you strip away from man of the things that like he loves, until you start to lose his identity, or until man starts to lose his identity. And that the resolution of that is that it's not the things that are that make up the identity of the man, or like the things that he loves that make up the identity of the man, but rather his capacity to like let go of those, but then to take responsibility for what has been given to him. And that it is through the taking of responsibility that we experience the taking of responsibility and retaking of responsibility, as things are constantly being stripped of us because of death or other types of things, that is how you experience life. And it is that pursuit of that continued line of life that brings you closer to God. And that's kind of like the idea of the promise of redemption, or that will achieve this sort of ideal state. Anyway, so just like
I gotta say, I'm actually, although I think it is an unorthodox and anachronistic form of theology, I'm quite partial, or at the very least sympathetic, to Jung's interpretation of this in The Answer to Job, which you could shorthand as something like, God's kind of an asshole in that book, and and he throws a hissy fit when he gets challenged, and then he experiences shame, moral shame, which then in that account sort of causes the evolution of that archetype, right? It's how the self evolves and becomes less whatever. We can talk about that at some point.
That is actually, yeah, there is, it's, well, it's that I think that Jung was talking about that series of questions that happen where what is it? I think like,
where wert thou when I laid the foundations of the earth? Canst thou drop Leviathan with a hook?
Yeah. But then the idea that like, and I'm gonna do shame to this argument, but that to just interpret it from the frame that the answers to the questions, that those are being provided as answers to the questions that kind of like close the loop, that is the wrong frame to take them from, because the real purpose of a question is to evolve our thinking. It's not to just get, you don't just ask a question to get the answer, but rather to ask a better question. That's kind of the idea. And I, unfortunately, these are things that I'm still like trying to understand from my readings, that like I don't quite fully understand. So for me to be able to explain it, I'm doing a bad job. But
no, I don't think so. It just, there are two different interpretive frames for something like that. I mean, there are a lot more than two, but in one is the sort of the apologetics frame, right? This is where you're trying to square off the evident paradoxes in something by providing some kind of exegetical digestion of the bits that seem indigestible, right? In fact, that second story in Genesis is an excellent example of that, right? So there's the first Genesis that you're talking about is the 7 days tour, right?
Yeah.
It's like, separate the waters and make fish and et cetera, and then take a nap. And it was good.
Yeah.
Which is a good reason to take
No,
naps on the weekend.
Isn't it was good? That comes in the second one, right? Or in the first one, is there that it was good? I thought there was a second one where he was doing stuff, or no, maybe it was the first one where it was
I think it's the first one. Yeah, he did da-da-da, and it was good.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right.
Because there is one, is whatever the day is, that is it the fourth day? He says it was good twice. And so that day is twice as good, which has religious significance in Judaism. It's the day that's twice as good.
Yeah.
But anyway, and then the second one is, of course, the start and stop one. It's the classic Adam and Eve story, right? Garden of Eden, God walking in the cool of the evening and all that jazz. The thing that's interesting about that one, in part, is the first one doesn't have any backtracking. There are no, it's not like he says it was good, but not quite good enough. That's not what happens. What happens is it's a sequence of things, right? A plan. Whereas in the second one, there is this start and stop quality. And that start and stop quality has also been sort of exegetically expanded, right? So if you include the myth of Lilith. So for instance, he creates man, and then he, removes man's rib and creates woman. And there's a set of myths around that introduces Lilith as the first Eve, and then there's a middle Eve that gets uncreated immediately because she has no skin, and Adam freaks out. And then but also, of course, that's the one that contains the fruit of the knowledge of good and evil, which is a fascinating sequence, right? Not least because God is talking to somebody else in that whole sequence, right? He's talking to the other gods or angels or somebody, right? And as pointed out by the Gnostics historically, but it's just correct, just on a straight reading, the serpent doesn't lie, right? It might tell the truth in order to guide them towards a bad end or something, but the serpent doesn't lie. The serpent just tells the truth. God lies. God says, if you eat we've gone right down a different rabbit hole. God says, if you eat all the trees in this garden are yours, but not this one. If you eat of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, you'll die. Okay, which in a roundabout way is true. But what in fact happens is they're all poking around. Eve runs into the serpent. The serpent says, how come you don't eat that one? And she says, God said we shouldn't. And the serpent says, that's not true. In fact, what the issue is that God knows that if you eat of that, you'll take on, moral consciousness or whatever, and then you will be like the gods. And in fact, God, as an aside to other gods or spirits, at one point says as much, right? It's like that scene in the Tower of Babel, where he's like, uh-oh, they're getting ahead of themselves. Let's go down and confuse their speech. Right? And goes and scrambles everybody's language centers, so brocas them in the head. So then Eve, of course, goes, she eats the fruit, right? She gives the fruit to Adam. Adam eats the fruit. Both of them suddenly realize they're naked. They go hiding. God is walking in the cool of the garden in the evening, which is a lovely image, right? Well, walking about whistling. And he's like, guys, where are you guys? Right? Be a terrible pastor. Anyway, and I am a reverend in the state of California. But anyway, I'm a minister in the state of California legally. So he's walking around, guys, and they sheepishly come out, right? Presumably, covering their junk. And God says, why are you clothed? Maybe they stitch clothes at this point, actually. Yeah. Why are you clothed? And they're like, and he's like, did you eat the fruit that I told you not to eat? And Adam says, was the woman's idea.
But why do you think that God lied
there? The snake
there?
told me to do it. And, and then the snake doesn't get to say anything. God just subjects it to a punitive design reevaluation where he blows its legs off. May you crawl on your belly, right? And then sets enmity between the children of man and the children of the snake. May you kick at his head and he shall strike at your heel. And then he saddles women with unpleasant labor and men with backbreaking labor in the fields, which presumably is why labor is the word for both of those things. And then, cast them out of the garden. And, right?
Sorry, but why do you think that God lied there? Like he just said, don't eat the fruit.
He says, don't eat the fruit or you'll promptly die.
Does he say you'll promptly die?
Well, he doesn't say promptly. I think he says something akin to that. The intimation is that if they eat the fruit, they'll immediately die. So they don't. They become subject to death because he kicks them out of the garden. But that's not what it sounded like. You know what I mean?
But isn't that a form of death? Like that is the...
Yeah, it's a form of death. But see, that's what I'm saying. We're doing a little bit of apologetics. Like we're trying to rub the rough edge off a little bit. It's not that he says, don't eat the fruit or you're out of here. At which point I will no longer give you access to the immortality fruit. That's not what he says. He intimates that the fruit itself contains death. Now, you can pull back from this and say, well, and it did, see? But it sort of removes the role here, which is seemingly within this story, God is specifically attempting to protect a privileged access that he and whomever he's talking to have to this thing. They will become like us. Well, what's wrong with they will become like us, especially if you would, right? If that's supposed to be part of the long range plan. It's not clear at all why the snake gets smoked. What did the snake do wrong? All the snake did was say, that's not true. You'll just get knowledge of good and evil, which is true. Now, arguably, I guess you could say, right, which led to death. So the snake deceived them by omitting the death part or something. But, regardless, the Gnostics definitely looked at this and said, wait a second. Like something is wrong here. That's why you get this inversion so often with the Gnostics, where the bad guys of the Bible are the good guys of the Gnostics, right? And they contend that that being who's in the garden, who is very clearly not, omniscient, guys, where are you? What did you do? Right? It's asking questions. And Old Testament God is a pretty capricious fellow. Like he can be magnanimous, he can be generous and whatever, but he can also be capricious as hell. And that figure they contend, of course, is not God. It is the demiurge, the ape of God, Yaldabaoth, the Gnostic demiurge. He just thinks it's God or pretends that it's God, but it's not actually the creator. And the snake, of course, for specifically for the what are they called? Ophidian, no, not Ophidians, Ophideites. Anyway, whatever. The sect of Gnostics that take the snake as a sacred figure contend, no, the snake tells the truth. And I have to admit that I'm kind of sympathetic to this. I mean, I wrote a novel about it, so I'm biased. But as far as I can tell, the snake does tell the truth. Now I'm going to get blasted with like 1,000 comments about why I'm biblically misreading this. But the point is, there are two frames. Lots of things in sacred text generally, but certainly in the Bible, are like this, right? The parables, very often hard to parse, right? You sort of like try to them. When you look at the Gnostic versions, what you often find, right, Gospel of Thomas or something, is you'll find a version where they've made it coherent. they add things in that suddenly make the story make sense. But in fact, I suspect that the impact of many of the original parables is in no small part due to the lingering paradoxicality of it. Like, Jesus says something and it's confusing. There's a lot of stories over and over again where he delivers, a thing, and then afterwards the disciples were confused. And then Jesus is like, okay, guys, right? And explains it. But even the explanation is not often like there are funny bits in it. The prodigal son, that's a tough story to process if you really think about it, right? And it's very much in that sense like Job. It's like, so the lesson here is things are unfair, but that's fair.
So, I mean, I guess like there's a couple of things that are coming to mind, and partly because I'm tired. This is going to be a bit more of a disjoint conversation.
Yeah.
So
this isn't gonna be the rigorously structured dialogue that our audience has come to. You're good. I'm digressive as hell. But anyway, okay, but that's
fine. So there's two things, I guess, that are coming to mind. One of them is the fact that the Bible was written by a whole bunch of people, like it was edited by a whole bunch of people, and that it's kind of been through like the pulling of stories from all over the place and these multiple editors that we've kind of pursued this sort of like line of truth that's come through, that's also been like the voice of God, or that's speaking to them. And that's kind of the evolution of the biblical stories, but that you do get this sort of Fry describes it as like this sort of snake-like curve where you've got the ideal images at the top of the curves, and then the apocalyptic sort of images at the top of the curve, and then at the bottom you've got these demonic images, and that at the top, these ideals that we're sort of trying to pursue, that as you move along the curve, it's getting better and better at sort of like their iterations basically that are moving closer and closer towards a form of perfection. But then you also get this sort of evolution along the curve from even in terms of the covenants that God makes to the people, that they start off with something like with Noah, where it was like, okay, I'm not going to kill you guys anymore. And then after that, then it becomes like the ideal promise becomes, well, I'm going to give you land and a family. And then it's like, okay, well, maybe actually that wasn't the ideal. And then the next thing is like, I'm going to give you or promise, is it that you'll be a holy land, that something like that, that you'll with priests, and then after that it's that you'll be a king, or that you'll have a descendant who will inherit or who will have an everlasting kingdom, something like that. So it's an evolution of things that seems to become more and more abstract. So when the criticism about God tossing Adam and Eve from the garden, and that would be death, that the fact that we're now like that may sound like a literal instance, but that there's these interpretations that come later on that's more like, well, that's more of like a symbolic interpretation, that is kind of like the natural evolution of it, and that doesn't make it false. It's just like that's that's part of it. So there's that, and then also again, this idea that this is more of like a more disconnected idea, I would suppose, but it's just something that I found very interesting, is the idea that the Bible does not provide specific, on the most part, it doesn't tell you specific actions that are evil or good, but rather it provides a series of images that it juxtaposes of these like ideal states and these demonic states, so that you'll get things like the Tower of Babel as being one of the more demonic ones, versus I forget, but like the Garden of Eden, for example, is like an instance of a more idealistic one. But you get these juxtapositions of these images as opposed to like the pure description of actions, and that it's through this juxtaposition and you reading through them and navigating through them that you begin to put your own experiences as you live life, kind of imagining those, like what it is to walk through the desert, and to just be trying to listen for the voice of God, that you have experiences that sort of fill into that space. And that then makes the words of Jesus, for example, that are really confusing in the parables that are said in such an authoritative way, in the same way that a general will lay a command out to his soldiers, and it will be like, do this, and that he doesn't give context, but it's up to the soldiers on the ground to then make that command contextually relevant. That's what happens as we begin to navigate through the Bible, with these images as being like the ideal versus the state that you're trying to move away from. And then you have your own experiences that then make those authoritative parables suddenly start to make sense to you. And as you continue to read the Bible, they make more and more sense in different ways as you've added more contextual nuance to them.
Right. So that's very much in Fry's structuralist mode, and it plays deeply into, I think, one end of this thing, which is the abstract, intuitive, exegetical game, right? I mean, like running interpretation in this way. Okay, so Jesus's parables. Okay, so you could be like, all right, so he gives a seemingly confusing story to people, which then has, circumstantial application in the abstract as a pattern when they find themselves in such and such a place. Okay, maybe. But also another way to look at that is, or it's, and it can be an and or, right? But maybe it's like a Zen koan, or Shakespeare's modification of Hamlet, right? The Zen koan is not rational. It's not the kind of question, right? What is the sound of one hand clapping? Does a dog have Buddha nature? These are not questions that are designed to be rationally answered or rationally resolved. They're questions that are designed to prick at the mind, right? And to deflate the rational enterprise. And Jesus, if nothing else, is kind of a provocateur. The guy's a shit disturber. He's a table flipper, right? The guy has a lot of trickster in him, right? And so this telling stories that leave people kind of unsettled in their lack of certainty actually strikes me as quite likely. You look at the encounters that he has with various priests and things, and he's like a rhetorical, he's something of a rhetorical master, but he uses, I think, a fair number of interpretive sort of dirty tricks to the positive, right? He flips things on them in ways that are unexpected. Likewise, you consider, Shakespeare's version of Hamlet, and this is T.S. Eliot's take on it, but Hamlet is a pretty old, but not as old as the Bible, but it's a pretty old story. It certainly precedes Shakespeare. Shakespeare adapted it as he adapted many of his plays. But as T.S. Eliot points out, one of the interesting things about Shakespeare's version of Hamlet is that he sort of omits the core constraining motivations from the story. So it's not clear why the hell Hamlet behaves the way that he behaves. Right? So in the original version, there's like reasons that he can't just act. But in this version, there aren't. And it's removed, it's taken out. And so you get this thing where Hamlet is endlessly cogitating while you, the viewer, sit on the edge of your seat in the Globe Theater going, fucking do something, stab somebody, right? Which of course he eventually does, and it turns out terribly. T.S. Eliot's take on that is, it is that removal that actually makes this version of Hamlet intensely compelling, because it leaves this gap that we're like, what, right? And that kind of inconsistency, that kind of incoherence within something can actually be a tremendous pull for attention, because we want to resolve it, right? We worry it like a paradox. So I actually think that some of the paradoxes, I mean, yeah, the Bible is obviously stitched together, right? It doesn't, the two halves of it are stitched together. The council in 325 made very politically driven selections. The original book is stitched together. It has lots of Near East, Mesopotamian mythology in it, right? Replicated stories, flood myths, very common, yada, yada, yada. Although a bunch of those early books all seem to be attributed to one author, right? The so-called Book of J. And nevertheless, it's stitched together, but it's stitched together in a way that doesn't smooth out the incoherence. I mean, there are two creation myths.
So it's interesting. I just want, like, I don't know where this is going to go, but that idea that you just said of the fact that Shakespeare's Hamlet removed the context, and that was what engages the reader. That is so interesting, because that's the exact like argument, which is that like with Jesus, that his statements of the parables and that you've removed the context in a way from that, and that his state, so that then the reader is the one who is providing the context by their own experiences, by trying to make sense of what Jesus is saying, by connecting it to their own knowledge and their own experience, which is kind of like the product of their own culture within which they're embedded, and then engaging in conversations with other people about these experiences, so that you get kind of like this combined sort of vision that it's interesting that you're saying that that's what sort of engages the reader in this like creative process, that's exactly what Fry's argument, I think, is for Jesus. Yeah, that he's removed the context, and that it's the reader who's providing the context by trying to make Jesus's sayings personally relevant, and that it's through that process that your own life becomes an analogy to Christ.
So what I'm saying, I guess, is right that when you're looking at a complex text in that way, right, one of the frameworks that you can come at is the assumption, right, in a kind of death of the author sort of way or something, that it all makes sense. You just have to look at it the right way, and it all makes sense. It really is all coherent, and it's all on purpose, and it's all doing a certain thing, and it all makes sense. And granted, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So the Bible has stood the test of time. It's because it's a very rich book full of lots of mythological examples that really do plug into our lives, yada, 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 yada. But another way to look at it is that it's a human document that is not coherent, and that isn't like, this isn't an intentional effect per se. So there's a shit disturber part of me, right? Clearly. The kid that got followed around on the playground after I promoted prime mover theory in religion class. Apparently Aristotle was too ultra at Catholic school, right? And that kid who's just like but wait a second. I think that there is actually a utility sometimes to coming at these texts sort of at face value without trying to interpolate a structuring coherence, right? Just to look at them as, like on their face. It's like dream interpretation, actually. Sometimes when you're looking at dream interpretation, right, you abstract things away, right? So you abstract up to some kind of level in order to fit it into da 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 da. But a lot of the time, if you're doing sort of active imagination or something with a dream symbol, you take it as at face value as you can. You treat the circumstances as though it's the circumstance, right? And you reveal sort of different things by each of those layers. So don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to shut down the one end of the exegetical practice. I think that it's important, and bringing in contextual material in that way is obviously important to the general. I mean, that's a big part of what exegesis is doing. You're working and reworking the material in order to get that kind of endless productivity out of its symbols. But at the other end, you have a mess of things that is apparently not coherent. And I think if you approach it as not coherent, you get a different kind of story that has its own value.
So I actually agree. But I think that like,
oh, damn it. That's not what this show's about.
Sorry, I actually agree. And yeah. Sorry.
No, so... we don't have to agree. And we don't have to agree to disagree, but we may agree. So I agree too.
End of show. We just got the agreement, and we're not even saying why.
That's it. We worked our way around to agreeableness, everybody.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I think that I agree in part. Maybe this is better. So the reading things as they are, which would be like reading them literally, in a way, but it's not really, it's
to whatever limit one can, obviously.
to whatever limit one can. Yeah, that's like if you're just reading the Bible as being like a myth, you're reading it in its symbolic way, that like it is incoherent in that it's ordered in a symbolic, like it is, it's ordered in it. It's ordered in a mythical way where it's about, it's ordered according to patterns of experience, and that it's not ordered by a single person writing a story, but rather they've kind of put these personas on collections of stories that are ordered according to narrative. And that when you read the Bible in that framework, seeing it as a collection of like metaphors or myths, that you develop, that's how you develop sort of like the objective understanding of it. That's the thing that's kind of separate from you, that is then like the when we talked about the difference between procedural experiential knowledge versus propositional knowledge, and that the development of wisdom comes from, you have these sort of propositional statements of like ideas of gratitude or leadership or things like that, and then as you navigate through life, you develop a sense of what a good leader is, because you've kind of like put your own experiences that map onto the categorical idea of leadership.
It becomes perspectival and participatory.
Exactly. So that the act of reading the Bible as being incoherent, but also sort of ordered in this mythical way, that's how you develop sort of like a propositional knowledge, and that it's that then by reading it from the perspective of it being this creative process where you're providing the context and trying to understand the words of Jesus through your own experiences and connecting it with other bits of knowledge and things like that, that's how you then engage in that process that makes it perspectival.
Sure. I mean, so in that sense, it's propositional insofar as you just take it, in without running this. Procedurally speaking, yeah, there's an intense training in meaning making. I mean, that's what having a story that requires a bunch of interpretation, right? And the fact that that Judaism has such a strong interpretive, reinterpretive tradition, right? That's the rabbinical tradition, is a tradition of commentary and reinterpretation, which obviously has had massive effects on their culture. I mean, I think a reasonable argument can be made that most of the like core Western, intellectual leaps of the 20th century came in one way or another from Judaism, and a lot of it has to do with these radical reinterpretations, right? They're big interpretive jumps. And then say what you will about things like, postmodernism, which means a lot of different things with a lot of different values, depending on the field that you're applying it. But, the idea of interpretation and the difficulties of interpretation, and right, like this is not it's not as stable as we thought it was. And I mean, this is one of the critiques that gets leveled against Fry, as much as I love Fry, right? I like Fry, but the structuralist project, comes under fire in part because of, some of this, some of these games that he likes to play. Beautiful stuff. Again, I like Fry.
Can you outline what is the criticism against him?
Probably not.
Oh no, shoot! I would love to hear it.
I mean, okay, so the question,
even in a bad sense, I've said a lot of descriptions today in a bad sense, and I'm hoping that the audience will be able to figure it out.
If people can't figure out that we're muddling a bit, that's then it's fine. Okay, so one of the things is that I'm going to mangle this. Yeah, I think part of it is, of course, that he brings this sort of a just so quality, right? The whole thing about a structuralist take is it, sets up a categorical system, and it typically ignores exclusions and things, like it fits roughly speaking, but it's imposing a structuralist account that maybe isn't actually present in the text, right? It's a framework that is imposed. So if Fry, and to my way of thinking, this I think, honestly, misunderstands the nature of interpretation, right? You know, you can have multiple interpretations of something and multiple categorical systems of description for something, and they can be sort of differently wrong, but still useful, right? So,
Yeah.
right, when we talk about, you know, God forbid I'm invoking Kuhn, but when we talk about paradigm shift, right, and this is the example I was used, is like, look, you know, as soon as Einstein drops, right, Newtonian mechanics in physics are out, right? They're the framework of physics under Einstein it operates in a completely different way. It is not a continuation of Newtonian mechanics. It is a refutation, an overturning, a replacement. Nevertheless, we still teach Newtonian mechanics. Why? Because they're useful, right? It's an imperfect system, but every system is imperfect. What it is a good closed mechanical system that doesn't require you to make relativistic equations for throwing a baseball, right? So it maintains utility. Lots of imperfect systems have utility, right? You know, we were talking about this last night in class, but you know, I very much doubt that the big five is going to be the final personality theory that we come up with, right? There are all kinds of problems in it, but it's the best thing we've got so far. Like, it does stuff, right? It's better than MBTI in some ways. MBTI, or not MBTI, I actually hate MBTI, but you know, Jungian typology is full of holes, for instance, as I'll talk about, right? So, you know, it's not a bad theory. It's just not the truth. It's an interpretation which lets you maneuver in certain ways. I would tend to say that interpretation, broadly speaking, is like this. You can interpret something one way and do something with it that way, interpret it in a different way, do something different with it. You're going to foreground things differently.
Well, this is like the narrative process of human development, right? Like when you first said, like, you need to make an attempt at trying to understand the chaos of your life. And then that's how you come up with like your first sense of what your purpose is. And then that's inherently incomplete. So then you find out the stuff that was left out and you try and like resurrect that from yourself and you reform your narrative and then you head off in a different direction. In the same way that theory development happens, where like it puts a certain framework on things and then you realize all the pieces of data that it left out, and then you try and reform the theory in a different way.
Right. Or you wall yourself off and strenuously ignore all outliers.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Or that. And yeah, that's the good way of going about it. In the same, I was just going to put this one last anecdote and then I want you to continue on why Fry's argument, but just like with interpreting game tape for basketball is like this, especially with a team that's younger, like I've spoken about before with the team that I'm working with, that's all rookies, except for two girls or except for one girl. And yeah, when you're looking at their game tape and it's like, oh my gosh.
This team I had is among the reasons Christine is tired.
Yes.
Which we didn't touch on, but the team has been, the team turns out to be a candle burning at both ends sort of process.
Very much so. Yeah, it was, yeah, anyway. So when you're watching game tape, it's like, oh my goodness, like, what do you focus on? Like, what is the first thing that you start to fix? Because like, you could look at this from so many different angles. Like, are you looking at it from the angle of like bad habits? Are you looking at the angle from how they're not fitting in?
Never take your eyes off the gorilla that goes to the middle of the frame. Never take your eyes off that gorilla.
Yeah.
That's a psychology joke. If anybody, it's gorillas in our midst. Never take your eyes off the invisible gorilla. Rule 1 of basketball. Anyway.
Yes. Yeah, so it's just, there's so many frameworks from which you could interpret the game tape from and then say like, this is the area that you need to improve. And it's, when you're watching the game tape at first of a bunch of rookies and you see this, it's like you just start getting anxious and then you're like, and then you don't even, if you listen to that impulsive you won't, you'll just end up being an anxious wreck. Instead
Okay, so I'm sticking a pin mentally in here. So the pin is chess. I'm not going to say it yet. keep going.
Okay, it's almost done. But so then what you have to do is you just kind of have to come up with like, okay, what's a plan for a framework? Okay, so maybe I'll work from the end with the end in mind, and you'll say, okay, what are the systems that they need to learn? Let's work back from there. What are the skills? Okay, now what are the bad habits that I need to suss out? Okay, let's start with the bad habits. We're just going to deal with those in this game tape, and we're going to ignore everything else. And it's clearly incomplete, and it's clearly not like the best thing, but like, we're going to go with that. So like, what are 5 bad habits? All right, here's the game tape for that. These are the bad habits you guys need to fix. And it's, oh man, but that's like, you got to start somewhere with engaging with it and trying to make sense of it. And it's not because of a sense that your framework that you've created is right or the truth. It's just like, you know, that by doing that, you're going to start cleaning up the chaos of their behavior and their actions, and then you'll start to notice other patterns, and then you'll capture those bad habit patterns, and then you move on to the next state of understanding. And yeah, so anyway,
start at any loose thread, pull until sweater is gone. First find a loose end.
Only I think that like the hope here is that you're actually forming a sweater as opposed to deconstructing.
Find any loose end, knit said loose end, ravel it into the knitted sleeve of care. There, that was my Shakespeare quote for the day. Sleep knits.
Yes.
See, there was a theme. I brought it back. Sleep knits the raveled sleeve of care. Anyway,
chess.
Chess. Oh, sorry. What I was just thinking was, when you're looking at the game tape and you're trying to figure out what to process, the thing that flashed to my head was, is this like the chunking problem with chess masters, right? So there's a sort of a classic set of things where, you know, chess masters are capable of assessing, right? Grandmasters and masters are capable of assessing games and holding them in memory. And, you know, you might think that this is a working memory capacity thing, right? That they can do this. But as it turns out, what it is a complex chunking maneuver. And the way that you can determine this is that if you show them a coherent, sensible board state, right? Then they can glance at it, chunk it, and remember it. But if you show them a randomized board state, basically something that makes no sense, and they can't chunk it, they can't remember it. So their ability to chunk it relies on it falling into the explicable pattern that they've internalized, right? And if you think about the sequence of the sequence of expertise with chess, right? You start playing chess for the first time, you don't know what you're doing. You make illegal moves, right? You'll try to do things illegally, and the person playing with you is like, no, you can't do that. You still see moves that you're not allowed to make. You do that even longer if you are just a cheat. For instance, do you know the story of Napoleon and the Turk?
No.
Okay, it's very brief. The Turk was a mechanical automaton that toured through Europe in the 18th century. It was like a mechanical chess-playing man. It probably was not, in fact, an automaton, but rather contained an achondroplastic dwarf that played chess. But nevertheless, people thought it was an automaton. A copy of it, named Ajib, ended up in Canada, actually, at one point, and was worshipped as a shrine in Quebec. And I think was destroyed in a fire in the 40s in a warehouse in New York State. But anyway, Napoleon, lots of people played this thing, the Turk. It toured around, people played it. Napoleon played it, and allegedly, Napoleon attempted to cheat. Like he made a cheating move, at which point the Turk simply picked his piece up and replaced it and then took its move, right? And he did this twice, and then the third time it picked up his piece and tried to replace it, he got up and discharged a pistol into the Turk, shot it for having the temerity to call him out on cheating, and hopefully he didn't wound or graze the dwarf inside. Anyway, but if you're beginning chess, you still see illegal moves that are not permissible.
Yeah.
If you're a beginner at chess, you sort of stop seeing illegal moves, right? They are no longer part of your consideration. But you still see like really bad moves. Like you still make bad moves, right? If you're a little better, you sort of stop seeing bad moves. All the moves that you see are reasonably good moves, depending on the sort of the depth of your prediction and your ability to sense the strategic space. And then, allegedly sort of grandmasters don't see moves. They only see gestalt. They see like holistic board states. But we know from that chunking experiment, right? It's like if you give somebody the random string of letters, their recollection is right? They can recall some string, some span. But of course, if those letters are chunked, FBI, CIA, NFL, they can remember them very readily because of the chunking. And it seems like they board state chunk it, right? And that's roughly consistent, I would say, with what we see in terms of brain activity, where the brain activity of experts is considerably reduced in the same task. They have optimized little pathways, right? So this is what was going through my head as you were describing watching game tape. And I thought, is the difficulty here that there's too many things to focus on? Or is the difficulty that what you're looking at is distant enough from a coherent board space that it's sort of hard to parse? Like, right? And so then it's just like, okay, let's just find one fucked up thing. What's the fucked up thing? Okay, there. What are you doing? Tina, why are you doing cartwheels? This is not gymnastics, Tina.
Yeah, that's funny. So I think that part of it comes from the fact that I'm entering into this level of coaching for the first time. So I think that it is actually exactly what you're saying, which is like, I'm not a grandmaster of chess at this point. And I think that as you gain more years of experience as a coach, you start to know what the win state looks like in the way of like player development. Like you start to get the entire progression of player development from start to finish, and you have enough experiences of the pattern of what the win state is that you can then begin to you work backwards from that, and you've kind of chunked it so that like how to get them from point A to point B, from like a chaotic player up to that point, like what things you can ignore at each level. And right now I'm doing that by a process of, and from what I've heard from other, like from master coaches, is that they do the same process, which is where they work backwards from their systems that they've decided are the ones that they're going to run. And then they work backwards from there to come up with the habits and the skill development and the player IQ that you're going to develop along the way, and the stages in which you're going to develop that. And then it's through the years of experience of watching how defenses then adapt to those decisions that you've made, that you then create more and more nuance into those levels of development. But
but they are imposing an interpretive system, right? Not every coach has the same opinion. Presumably, they have
totally, and they
different
actually are
ideas
conflicting.
About, right,
yeah,
right.
Yeah.
Okay, so this is the thing. They're imposing something which is foregrounding certain aspects, and then that's a good way to drag things down and foreground certain kinds of featural aspects, right? If you're stuck at the gestalt, big picture, it's like right? If you have a system that then foregrounds, right, an interpretive framework that foregrounds certain features, and you pick those features out, and you get kind of good at recognizing how those features, right? This seems to be the universal sign of correlate or something, maybe cause. Anyway,
this is
entangled particles or something. My body speaks a separate but related language to what I speak. So yeah, and so if there are differences, it's like you've got this gestalt, right? And you're like, and so you block it, and then you can pull features out, and different people have different theories, and those theories are presumably validated by their points.
By it working, by like winning
basketry
games.
Winning. That's what I'm looking for, right? Winning conditions. And then basketry, winning conditions, and then and then again, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, right? Theories are in competition. They are in competition insofar as those theories are therefore predictive of the desired outcome. It's interesting though, because those theories have competing goals in some ways. Anyway, but how did we get here from the Bible? Fry.
Yeah, we did. But there was there anything else that we needed to loop off there? Maybe not. Maybe we'll just leave it.
Yeah.
Okay, so you were telling me about the criticism of Fry, the structural.
I thought we were gonna cruise past that. I gotta look it up.
Okay.
I will just 100% admit I don't have it ready to mind. I mean, you know, some of those criticisms, I suspect, some of those criticisms are a feature of academic fashion, right? The academy and fields have fashions like anything else, right? Things come in, they're very popular, they go back out. Some of them, I'm sure, have some, you know, like I'm sure there are some sort of philosophically or theoretically grounded critiques, and I'm sort of struggling to pull those, right? And I assume some of these things are about, you know, whatever. Generally speaking, structuralism came under fire at some point for imposing or imposing structures on texts that are not necessarily there. And see, again, my way of thinking about that is like, well, looking at a text, you know, in that way is one way of looking at it that does certain things for you, but I'm disinclined to choose one over the other. I think sometimes it's useful to look at the text as an incoherent thing, and sometimes it is useful to look at the text as a more coherent thing, and there are different forms of coherency that you can bring about with different interpretive frameworks and.
Okay, so yeah, so I suppose like your idea then of it being incoherent is the fact that initially I was kind of drawing a line between that and like its mythical structure and saying that it is in fact coherent, but the incoherence is ordered by a certain way. But then the argument about that is that the specific individuals who create the mythical coherence out of the Bible are in fact imposing a structure on it that people will say doesn't exist. And that
because if that structure were sort of universally agreed upon and self-evident, right, then all religion would converge to fundamentalism. Right? That's the fundamentalist claim, essentially speaking, is no, the text is the text, and you read it straightforwardly and literally, and it's very clear. And I think I've said before, I'm deeply envious of fundamentalism in a way. Well, think about it. Like, okay, if you happen to have a very strong fundamentalist view of Christianity, then you essentially believe this: there exists a book which contains all of the answers to everything. All questions can be answered by this book in a straightforward way. It is already explicated. And the book, you don't have to like climb a mountain to get it. You probably have a copy, and everybody you know has a copy, and there's a copy in every, bedside drawer in every hotel and motel. What an astounding idea. I mean, I spent much of my life wandering through used bookstores looking for a book with like even some fraction of that kind of answer, and eventually discovered such a thing, it doesn't seem to exist. Or maybe I have to write it. But that impulse, right, that it's sort of obvious. If it was obvious, then why has everybody been arguing about the interpretations for forever and a day? It's not obvious, right? And I hear what you're saying, which is like, yeah, that lack of obviousness is what requires us to impose. And I agree. The creative act, I mean, speaking here as a writer and a lecturer and a dungeon master of the role-playing kind, not the S&M kind, leaving gaps, juxtaposing things, leaving incoherencies and leaving gaps, and then acting as though you meant to do it the whole time. Heads up if my players are watching this, right? And letting them impose an interpretation and then listening is one of the easiest ways to generate rich material. You throw two things out, they are juxtapositions, right? People bend over backwards to attempt to square those juxtapositions, right? And if you're careful and you pay attention, you can steer that process. If you're not careful, you end up backed into a corner or in a walled garden. Writers do this, right? Lost. Do you ever watch Lost?
I watched some of it.
How much?
It's just like, I don't know, how many seasons was it? I watched like the first couple
Like
seasons.
9,000.
And after that, I was like, now this is just getting crazy. Like when they started to have that like weird monster or whatever, like ambiguous monster that was on the island,
The
or
smoke
that
monster?
turned out to be like a machine or something like that. Or yeah, after
Okay.
at that point, I was like, I can't deal with this.
Oh man, the smoke monster ruled. But then, just as you know, spoilers for a show that went off the air 10 years ago. But then the smoke monster picks up Mr. Echo and kills him on a tree. And Charlie runs back to the beach, and everybody is still going through their love triangle horseshit. And Charlie doesn't spend every waking second going, guys, the smoke monster killed Mr. Echo. Instead, he somehow gets drawn back into the dramatic horseshit. That's where it started to fray for me.
Oh, interesting.
Anyway, that's a show where it was all dry powder setup and no pre-arc. And it was woven together. I suspect it was maybe one of the first shows that monitored online commentary for its feedback. So you get an episode like that first season episode where Hurley gets the lottery ticket, wins the lottery, gets numbers and wins the lottery, right? Great first season episode, good flashback episode, interesting. But people take to it, the numbers. And so the numbers become this repeated theme. This is a postmodern writing trick. Pynchon uses it. You repeat a pattern and you don't explicate why. And what gradually happens is, because there is an implicit assumption of coherence on the part of the reader's mind starts torturing itself, right? Trying to figure out how it fits. Because if there's a pattern, it's got to be a pattern. Read The Crying of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon, and it's full of this. And the whole game, again, spoilers, plug your ears, is it doesn't resolve. It doesn't resolve. It's an existential mystery, and it plays out one of these patterns, and it gives this tantalizing sense that you're right on the edge of putting it all together, and it just, like, the light cone expands out and it doesn't come together.
So,
right? So there's a technique in it, is what I'm saying, that you can use. I use it all the time, right? I come up with things. Sometimes it's just a failure on my part. I do two things, and one of my players who's paying more attention to some element than me says, but wait a minute, I thought such and such and such and such, but this such. And I say, that is interesting, isn't it?
So I agree, but I guess there's lots of patterns that are repeated that happen around us all the time, but we tend to ignore the ones that aren't, like they may captivate us for a little bit, but they won't continue to captivate us unless there is something in that pattern that the resolution of which is useful or important to us in some way. And this is that whole idea of, like, with synchronicity and the pursuit of spark, that the patterns that we pay attention to are the one and that call upon us to resolve them are the ones that will provide some utility in that answer. So the fact that the patterns that are shown in the biblical narrative have captivated the attention of so many people, I think is
an indication that they have some longstanding utility.
that it's not just a pattern for the sake of a pattern, that, like, to capture attention.
I'm sympathetic to that view, but the idea that the longevity of a text in that sense, right? Like, it's a little bit colored by survivorship bias, right? Like, I am sympathetic to that view. Generally speaking, I mean, there's a reason that I drum on my students and I say, if you have not read the Greek classics and you have not read the Bible, you're kind of culturally illiterate. Like, you should at least take a stab at it. You can't understand half the references that occur in the Western canon without tapping those two things. And I'm a big fan of the Bible. What a weird thing to say, but I'm a big fan. It's a good book.
Yeah.
I am. When I hit my Bible phase, I did lots of reading of it, and I've only done the cover to cover tour once, because slogging through the bagats. But nevertheless, I think it is a valuable text. I think it is a rich and valuable text. I'm sympathetic to that idea. That said, there is a kind of perfectionist notion, I think, that gets brought to bear. That there's an idea that there is some transcendent interpretive frame that in fact renders it into like a perfect jewel of human wisdom. And I mostly don't think that. I mostly think
Mhm.
it is a human construction. It's not a revealed document, revealed to some extent by the unconscious, obviously, because of precisely what you're talking about, right? Our fixation on certain stories. And okay, right, some of these things, you know, the flood myth. The flood myth was an extant myth, seemingly all over the world, evidence for Atlantis. Oh, quick, this is such an aside, but I meant to bring it up before, and then we had to cancel. Are you familiar with, so, okay, I'm going to roll this back. I just mentioned Atlantis. I mentioned Atlantis because of the flood myth. The flood myth occurs all over the place. This is one of these arguments that sort of Atlantean folks like the Flemaths use on cultural dispersion, the fact that these myths and things occur all over the world, and lots of the archaeological anomalies that we now see that don't square against the standard account, right? And I think that stuff has built up considerably, including like in Turkey, Göbekli Tepe, and lots of coastal discoveries. However, I was talking about this with a good friend of mine. And he, you know, I'm about to get into my Göbekli Tepe bit, and as we're having drinks, and he says, you know what the best evidence for Atlantis is? Monkeys. I add my friend is a respectable constitutional lawyer. He's like, you know what the best evidence for Atlantis is? Monkeys. And I say, he doesn't say it like, he sounds nothing like that. And I say, what? And he says, Old World and New World monkeys. Why are there genetically related monkeys in South America and Africa? And I thought about it for a second. And I was like, And he said, they didn't come across the Siberian land bridge, right? And even that idea is under fire. There are probably multiple waves of human migration, but you know, under the Orthodox story, they didn't come over the Siberian land bridge. And I was like, no, they didn't. And then he's like, do you know what the account is? Do you know what the standard account is? Because they diverge genetically, I think, 60 million years ago. So there's 60 Old World and New World monkeys diverged 60 million years ago, okay? And everybody knows if you take the globe, and it's like plate tectonics is actually pretty obvious once you have space photography, right? They fit together, okay, but that was quite some time ago, right? It was before 60 million years ago. Do you know what the standard account on New World monkeys is? I was shocked. It's
what?
A raft. That's the leading account. Go check it out.
Is that they came across on a raft?
Yeah, no, I don't think this is a Gilligan's Island thing. Like, I don't think the idea is that they constructed a raft with a sail. Hi-ho, that's not what's happening. But the account, at least as far as Wikipedia was able to tell me in a hot second, is that a population, clearly a big enough population to be a breeding population, traveled across the South Atlantic on a raft. What did they eat? Catch flying fish? What did they drink? My personal theory, the raft was composed of several hundred coconut trees, which, in wicking seawater into themselves, collected it into the coconuts, what the monkeys used both for sustenance and drink. Right? And it's a big enough population that's a breeding population gets over. That's apparently the leading theory. Isn't that fascinating? So anyway, just sticking a pin in there.
That's the leading theory is
right.
A raft.
So that's how I felt. And maybe there's more to it than that. This is not my area of expertise. But it was,
why would you choose to go out in the ocean with a bunch of trees that
well, you didn't,
with no food?
The thing
it would have had to have been pretty bad.
It wasn't a choice. See, the monkeys were in the jungle and a tornado uprooted the trees and the monkeys. This isn't part of the theory. I'm adding this.
Okay, I was like, wait a second.
I'm adding an interpretive interpolation to make this make sense. And that would have deposited a mess of tangled trees and monkeys into the ocean, which then drifted across and landed in South America, where they rapidly learned to ride the capybaras that were native to the area. Or I guess it would have been full of megafauna or something. Anyway, it's a leading theory. It's one of these cases where you come across a bit of information, and my dear friend Matt Capel and I, many years ago, had this idea for a CBC series. So there was a CBC series at the time called This I Believe, in which people would go on the CBC radio and have short essays where they would express, their articles of faith. Preston Manning did one, and right. So this I believe, and my dear friend Matthew Capel and I had the idea for a comparable series called "This I Do Not Believe," in which we examined various things that often get repeated about history, and we just lay it out like this and say, no, I don't believe that. That's nonsense, right? Things like Roman soldiers were paid in salt because salt was worth more than gold. Roman legionnaires. No, sorry. No, Italy's a peninsula. You can get salt out of seawater. Gandhi did it. That's how they got around the salt tax. You're telling me that salt is more valuable than gold? I don't believe it. Nope. Well, the Earl of Sandwich invented the sandwich. Nope. No, we didn't. People have been putting meat on bread for some time, I suspect, right? Like picking things up with bread. Maybe he named it the sandwich because he was a local nobleman and his servants weren't about to say no. But, he's like, I think I've invented this. What a delightful treat. Anyway, sorry. Wow, I'm way the hell off now.
Wait, but what were some of the examples of the articles of faith? Like, what was some of the things that they said that they believed in?
Oh, I don't know. I'm sure you can listen to them online. It's been 20 years or something since I heard these.
Just like one example.
Preston Manning, I think, was actually talking maybe about Christian faith.
Oh, really? Okay.
Like, I think he made it, but yeah, the idea was that it was an open. I think he started this, I believe. And it was intended specifically as a place where people could give essays about things they believe. It was a cool concept. But the counterpoint, this I don't believe, where historically taken to be the case, commonplaces are not even debunked, just simply disbelieved. Just no, I'm sorry, no, that's nonsense.
Giving an interesting reason as to why you should not believe it, like with the salt in the ocean, not even like just like that's why.
And the monkeys, it's like, no. I'm sorry. At that point, it is just more plausible. My friend is right. It's more plausible to me that the reason that there are monkeys in South America is Atlantis. That is more plausible to me than the transatlantic raft theory. Now, I am bringing this up in part so that our viewers, such as they are, under the very likely conditions that they know more about this than I do, can like just chime in the comments and say, well, actually, that would be lovely, because right now it just seems like nonsense on stilts to me. And that's often an unfair characterization, but there are plenty of theories that are hot nonsense. The cerebellum in the brain has expanded more quickly over recent evolutionary history than any other part of the human brain, including the frontal cortex. You know what the conventional explanation is? Balance. Because obviously, walking on 2 feet would require us to have so much more processing power than a monkey that brachiates through trees. They don't need balance. What a bunch of horse shit.
That's something else you don't believe.
No, I don't believe it. In fact, it makes me mad. Right. Although maybe that's overturned. Why do you think
that the cerebellum has increased in size faster than?
Well, that's a whole subject, which also involves a discussion of whirling dervishes. But
okay, so maybe we should put a pin in that one.
For real, it does. And the fact that you can increase your solution on insight problems by dancing briefly. The reason I would tend to say is that the cerebellum originally is coordinating disparate systems of movement, i.e. balance, but that it is accepted into different kinds of coordination. So when you see damage in the cerebellum, right, if you get damage at a certain area, you get dysmetria, right? You get a discoordination in your motion. But if the damage is slightly higher or lower, whatever, on the cerebellum, you get what they call dysmetria of thought, which is to say that your ability to coordinate disparate pieces of information like analogy, right, and figurative language gets interrupted. So what that says is that yeah, right. So what that says is that the functionality is maybe accepted. In one case, what you're doing is sending information between limbs to coordinate limbs for complex motion. But right, when you get that accepted, you get other kinds of coordination between patterns. That's consistent with what we see with the work of Ito, who did studies where they scanned the cerebellum immediately prior to the solution of an insight problem, and immediately prior it lights up. And so that makes sense because an insight problem typically is, right, breaking frame and making frame to connect together two disparate areas of knowledge. So it's a disparate area connector, right? It's an orchestrator, and that's been accepted into higher levels of cognitive ability. So basically, as we get all of
It's
this
the thing that
complexity,
allows the perspectival knowledge to come about.
to some extent, I mean, it allows sort of the extended figurative bridging of knowledge, period.
But the fact that it's like part of it is the coordination of the body, like physical action. And then you're then like the idea that it's also, you said that your analogical reasoning or capacity, is it?
Yeah, I would have to look again, but it's figurative language. So like your ability to process, simile, metaphor, analogy gets screwed up.
Yeah,
And
which is, but
domain
like
connection, right?
yeah,
And domain transfer.
So your capacity to move or like to take these ideas of like symbols and stuff like that, and then to literally coordinate action, to make those connections like that. That is so interesting that's the act of the cerebellum, and that's the part that's grown faster as opposed to just like your pure capacity to reason.
Right. And so
Like
I'll end because we've only got a few minutes. I'll throw in. So it turns out in studies, if you have an insight problem that you're having problems solving, briefly dancing will actually substantially increase your ability to do it. Why? Because dancing is very cerebellar activity. You have to coordinate your limbs and balance and so on and so forth. So you fire up one part, you fire up the other part, right? And thus you fire up your ability to cross connect. And that in turn leads me to my theory of what is going on with Sufi whirling dervishes. What's with the spinning? Now, spinning is fun, kids know it, but what is happening there? Why are they doing
Sufi whirling dervishes?
So whirling dervish, so Sufism is the mystical branch of Islam, right? And whirling dervishes are figures that engage in a form of meditative prayer by spinning, by whirling. So they have these sort of skirts that go out from them. You can see footage of this online where they'll twirl, but they'll twirl in place for hours as a religious act, right? As a contemplative and meditative and prayer act. They'll spin and spin and spin in place, right? Fascinating. So
totally.
Again, one assumes that since it's been a persistent activity, there's probably some kind of utility to it, right? And my sort of half-baked theory on this is, right, doing that would hyperactivate your cerebellum, but also it would provide the sort of felt sense of sort of centripetal centering, right? So that you would feel a strong sense of center, right? But meanwhile, you're hyperactivating your cerebellum and all, right?
Yeah.
And therefore probably producing once you can do it without puking or falling over, you're probably producing a state of massively elevated religious insight.
See, I'm sorry, but all that I'm going to do from this is just take this as a pure justification for me as to like why, when I'm not just pursuing purely intellectual endeavors, or when I'm starting to get bored with more intellectual work, that I need to go out and like
spinning on the lawn.
Oh yeah, that I need to go and be physically active or like engage, like it's or like just or like anything like that, and that like it. But the physically active work that I tend to do does not pay money as opposed to the other parts. But then I'm like, oh, but then how do I justify it? And now I just have a justification for it. Well, I could not do the intellectual stuff were it not for me spinning out on the lawn. That's what's making it all make sense.
There you go. There you go. I mean, really, did you need a justification? Well, I guess so. That's exactly what you just said. But
yeah, exactly.
But yeah, it's the foundation of all of the foundation of the mind, as it turns out, is the body, maybe.
Or yes, the act of the two together.
Yeah, maybe.
That's what makes us human, tying the two together.
Maybe.
Maybe.
We don't know that.
That's how we
don't know that.
We're the voice of authority here. We're just like, maybe.
There's no authority to be had here. It's the hard problem. This isn't an answer. Is our mind and matter separate? Are they together? Are they separate domains? Is it materialism? Is it idealism? Is it panpsychism? We don't know. There are
Mhm.
arguments in a bunch of different directions. It's nice to see panpsychism, despite its issues, getting back a bit of intellectual credibility, to be honest. I have a soft spot for panpsychism, but it used to be persona non grata around the academy. I argued for it in a conference once, and I did win that debate. But mostly through, like, I don't know, whatever, sheer rhetorical onslaught.
I could see that.
Yeah. Good times.
I
I've got to wrap up. I've got to wrap up in a minute. Where? Okay, can we turn this around? Let's bring it back around. Oh, yes, we can. So the naming impulse in the Bible is the first commandment, and that exploratory value as we go forth into the unknown, or the seeming unknown, discovering for the first time situations that bear a similarity to situations that perhaps we've read in the past. We make inferences. I personally feel as though I'm exploring the universe of Giordano Bruno, who, among other things, was the first to propose that there might be life on alien worlds, and this got him burned by the church. But truly, isn't that the case, that the universe is a vast place full of differences that nevertheless have an indescribable degree of similarity and convergence? Did that roll? I don't know.
I mean, you did tie it back around to the naming, so I think that was great. And
Yeah.
and I'm sure that there's threads that will continue into the next episode, because because there was just a realization that I had about Fry. What basically the argument for him is that he's saying that there's an objective structure to the Bible, but then that is the act of him doing, and that's the piece that's objective, and that you're operating between that and then the reader creatively trying to make sense of the stuff that Jesus is saying. That those are the two perspectives, but then that's not taking the perspective that, in fact, the structure that Fry is saying that exists objectively within the Bible is he himself trying to make sense of the Bible, which is engaging in the other process. So now we've got like this circular argument, but then what I was saying is that there perhaps is some sort of objective understanding. And for me, I've identified with Fry's just because his sense that what the Bible means is that there is a path to self-recreation, and that there is a path to not to getting yourself out of the constant ups and downs of the slave master relationship, and that you can kind of have a continual state of energy or of life through through the tragedies, and that as you sort of navigate through the Bible and start to engage in that creative process with it, that you become better at not getting thrown around by life as much. That has been true in my own sort of adventure through the Bible, and that's the reason why Fry's structure that he imposes upon it, for me, when I look at it, and because it also kind of maps on with Jung's and things like that, that I feel as though that there is some type of truth that is within there that's not just Fry's own subjective kind of pattern making out of it.
So, and I'm inclined to think that what is truth? I'm inclined to think that it's not so much that it is true as that it's useful, which is a slightly different thing. Like, it's one useful lens, and it is useful. I like Fry a lot. I mean, there's a reason I own all the Fry, and now I got to go look up what the objections to Fry are so that I can actually talk coherently about that. But yeah, Fry's great. Right? It's something that I use with some frequency. Frankly, a bit like Jung. Jung is, in fact, Jung spends a lot of time trying to tell people, like, don't eat the menu, do not confuse the map with the territory, right? To get the sort of general semantics idea from Korzybski. But the thing is, like, it's still useful. Parsing things in that way is useful. You can do stuff with it, right? And so you can do stuff with it is the value that I see, rather than truth. It's not that it's the case, and I think that trying to, I don't know, I'm wary of settling on that, rather than oh, look what you can do with this. If you use this, you can do this. That to me is how I look at Fry. And Fry's amazing. That's precisely, in fact, why I defend structuralism in the current climate. is because it's like, look, there are problems that I don't remember, but but I'm told there are. There are problems, but that doesn't mean it's not useful, right? The same critique or I don't know, apology or something that I would bring to bear on all kinds of things. Yeah, there are problems with it, but that doesn't mean it's not useful, right? All of our schemas, all of our systems, all of our theories are full of holes. They're all fucking wrong and inconsistent, and they get flipped every 50 years. That doesn't make them useless. It just makes them not omniscient.
So I would agree with you, but I think that for me, I see the truth as like the evolutionary process where there may be like a fraction of Fry that will like he's got this tangent that built that like this line of like his theory that builds this way, and that like a bunch of things will then have a whole bunch of holes, but then it's still this piece right here that's a foundation that we're then building off of from the next theory, and that gets pulled along in the next theory that's a little bit more complete. And then you've got the next one that builds off of that pulls pieces from it, and there's still like a thread of Fry that's coming through this that like may only be this much by the end of it, but it's still a thread that's there that's continually being built upon and pulled upon from theory to theory. So I see it as like an evolutionary process where it is partly holding a whole bunch of different frameworks and looking at it through a whole bunch of different lenses, but that like, there are the threads of all those that you're pulling forward in this evolutionary process of trying to find truth.
Okay, this is clearly a whole conversation,
this is like,
which we need to have separately, because I just thought to myself, okay, right. So if we treat like Aristotle's theory of the comedy in that structuralist way, right? Where the comedy, the super most basic form of the comedy in a 3-act structure is, right? This plunge, this, and it's boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy gets girl back, or it's whatever, all a vast variety of plots you can map into this thing. And despite the fact that there are issues with Aristotle's formulation, this is hard to ignore as actually an emotional feature that really does seem to be playing some pivotal role. Can the same argument be made for Fry? We got to come back to this. Okay.
Yeah.
One last point just before we sign off here. And this goes for you, but it also goes for you, dear viewers. You should watch Muse.
Okay.
The documentary about Kobe Bryant. I had a student who wrote a paper on Kobe Bryant a couple years ago, and a client who has a deep personal connection to Kobe Bryant. They both independently recommended this thing to me, and I finally watched it a few years ago, and it's tremendous. And it was tremendous for me, and I do not have a close personal connection to sports ball, but you are an actual sports ball coach. And so I suspect that you will get whole levels out of this thing that I won't, but also it is an absolutely fascinating psychodynamic case study in how somebody becomes a sort of focused Kensai specialist being, but also the damage that can cause and how one expands outside of that and hits the spark in other directions. You should watch it. You're going to love it.
I wonder if I have watched it. Now I'm remembering you recommending it to me.
Yeah.
But I forget if I've watched it or not, which I mean is maybe an indication that I haven't watched it, because I feel like that would be something that I would totally remember.
You're staying home for the weekend, and both of us need to recover our perilous health as we convalesce. So you should watch it. You should watch it back to back with the documentary Jiro Dreams of Sushi. Or if you've never seen it, for God's sakes, Marwin Call.
Okay.
Marwin Call, which is one of the best documentaries. I make my students watch it every year. There you go. That's your triple hitter. Those documentaries, you're gonna pull so much. You're gonna be like, these are amazing. How did I? Yeah. Okay.
This is so good.
All right, we got to sign off.
Yeah, we got to sign off.
Thank you, everybody. And we will return, and presumably after we parsed it, pursue some of those threads with a little more coherence and hopefully a good deal more sleep. I hope everybody has a lovely day, either discovering the meaning of the world or imposing a useful structure that allows them to function within it.
There we go. That's nice.
it's like Hinks minks, the old witch winks, the fat begins to fry. Nobody's home but Jumping Joan, father, mother, and I.